I watched Peter Obi's interview with Seun Okinbaloye, and one question has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't the question about power, economy, insecurity, corruption, or how Obi intends to govern Nigeria if elected president. Instead, Okinbaloye took the conversation back to the Civil War and 60 years to the January 15, 1966 military coup. He asked Obi whether Nigeria has moved away and healed from the Civil War syndrome such that an Igbo man like Obi from Anambra, an Onitsha man, can become the president of Nigeria. He asked Obi how to deal with an Nziagwu coup, controversially labeled as the Igbo coup, and why Nigerians should trust an Igbo man with the presidency. He also asked Obi to convince Northerners watching the program tonight to trust him. Obi responded by talking about his relationship with the North, his investments and travels across the region, and his commitment to a united Nigeria. But I kept asking myself a different question. Why did Seun Okinbaloye feel the need to resurrect the politics of 1966 in a presidential candidate interview in 2026? For me, that was the defining moment of the entire conversation and also the most troubling. The question moved the interview away from Obi's competence and plans to his ethnicity and a historical event that took place years before he was born into public life. It subtly suggested that because Obi is Igbo, he carries the burden of explaining or apologizing for the actions of a group of soldiers who staged a coup 6 decades ago. Whether Okinbaloye's question was intentional or not, that was a dangerous proposition. The officers who planned the coup were not exclusively Igbo. Major Adewale Ademoyaga, one of the principal participants, was Yoruba. The July 1966 counter-coup led to the assassination of Ironsi and Lieutenant Colonel Adekunle Fajui. It also unleashed widespread killings of Igbo officers in Lagos military formations, Abeokuta, and civilians across northern Nigeria in what has been infamously called the pogrom. It also forced hundreds of thousands of Igbos to flee to the eastern region and eventually paved the way for the Nigerian Civil War. In many respects, the label Igbo coup became more than a historical description. It became a political narrative that shaped ethnic relations between the Igbos and the North for decades. Okinbaloye's question deserves scrutiny. A journalist has every right, even a duty, to ask difficult questions. As the country moves close to the 2027 presidential election, all candidates should be asked difficult questions. They should explain their policies, defend their records, and answer legitimate concerns. But there is a difference between asking a candidate about current political realities and inviting him to defend the actions of military officers who acted 60 years ago simply because they shared the same ethnicity. Would the same question have been asked of a northern presidential candidate over the officers who carried out the July 1966 counter-coup? Would other candidates be asked to account for every military action involving officers? Or is this burden uniquely reserved for Igbo politicians? By asking Obi whether the North should trust an Igbo man, the interview risked reinforcing an old stereotype about a coup many generations of Igbos have had the burden of having to explain. It suggested that before Obi could speak about fixing Nigeria, he first had to reassure the North that he would not repeat a history in which he played absolutely no part. The question before voters should not be whether Peter Obi is Igbo, and just like every other candidate, it should be whether they have the character, competence, and capacity to lead Nigeria. History should be remembered, but it should not become a permanent prison from which entire ethnic groups can never escape. The responsibility of a journalist is not simply to echo popular historical sentiments. It is also to interrogate the assumptions behind those sentiments. If a belief is built on a flawed historical premise, it deserves to be challenged rather than reinforced. That is where I believe Okinbaloye's question fell short. Instead of asking, should the North trust an Igbo man? The more appropriate question could have been, why, 60 years after the coup, does this perception still exist? Or, is it fair to hold today's generation of Igbo ethnic group and politicians accountable for events of 1966? Those questions would have examined the roots of the suspicion instead of accepting it as an established political fact. By framing the issue around whether Obi, as an Igbo man, should reassure the North, Okinbaloye unintentionally validated an old narrative that an Igbo presidential candidate begins the race carrying a burden that candidates from other parts of the country do not. It subtly suggested that before Obi could sell his policies, he first had to prove he was not a threat. That is a heavy burden to carry. Peter Obi was not born into politics in 1966. He was 6 years old when the war began. He neither planned nor participated in the coup and the events that led to the war. He did not formulate Decree No. 34. He was not involved in the counter-coup or the Civil War. Yet, because he belongs to the same ethnic group as some of the officers involved, he was placed in the position of defending a history that is not his own. This is not to suggest that we should forget our history as a people. Remembering our history is different from weaponizing it in contemporary politics. No Fulani politician is routinely asked to apologize for every action of past military rulers from the north. No Yoruba presidential candidate is expected to answer for every political crisis involving Yoruba leaders. No Ijaw politician is held personally responsible for the militancy that once plagued the Niger Delta. Individuals are judged by their own actions, not by the ethnicity they were born into. The same standard should apply to Peter Obi. If there are concerns about Obi's political alliance with Kwankwaso, his economic plans, or his understanding of the insecurity that plagues the country, they should be scrutinized. If there are questions about his record as governor of Anambra State, that should be grilled about them. The questions do not just elicit answers, they shape perceptions. Good journalism should do more than amplify old fears and stereotypes. The ghost of 1966 should not be allowed to overshadow the realities of 2027.